Thank you.
I'll give it back to you, track that. Let's see, that's, keep going.
You jumped pretty
I
far
had a
ahead.
trigger finger, I guess. Maybe I went fast forward or something.
Well, while I do this, I'll briefly introduce myself. Jonathan Johnson with the Hopping Law Firm. I do like to think I know a lot about districts. I know very little about technology. So, in that sense, you're in poor hands with this.
One more.
There we go. I'll try to hit the right buttons. I appreciate the opportunity to be back with you to talk about our proposed stewardship district. As you can see, we are proposing to establish a stewardship district over the approximately 24,000 acres that are included within the ENCPA. Stewardship districts have been used at a number of comparably large projects around the state. Some a little larger, Lakewood Ranch is a little bit bigger, some a little smaller, Ave Maria, Badcock Ranch, but all share in common the characteristics that you see here, which is a very large, long-term development plan with a lot of very sensitive environmental and conservation areas, and the need to coordinate over the long term with the local government, in this case, with you and your staff. And that is why we have sought and are asking your consent on Monday to move forward with this legislation. The legislation that's embodied in the drafts that you have ultimately looks and talks a lot like your typical community development district, of which you have several here in the county. The difference really being the size and the time period over which this district is intended to provide community governance and management and provide infrastructure financing. But otherwise, the powers that you see in this bill are comparable and much the same. It functions similarly in the sense that on day one, the landowners will elect the board on a 1 acre, 1 vote basis, and at certain triggers, that transitions over so that your future residents and Radiant's customers will ultimately then elect the board just as you're elected on a 1 person, 1 vote basis on the county supervisor of elections process. You see some examples that we've discussed where you see other stewardship districts in the state. And one of the reasons that you do see stewardship districts on so many of those projects is that it does help provide for this orderly financing, coordination, et cetera. I'm going to live dangerously and punch a button. If we were not to pursue the stewardship district, community development districts would be a likely avenue that would provide similar bond financing and community maintenance functions. However, given the size of the ENCPA, what you would likely see, it would be those districts coming in 800 acre and 1,000 acre bites over time. Each of those districts, if established, would have 5 supervisors elected. Each one would have an audit. Each one would have a budget. All the things you see called for in this legislation. So instead of 5 elected officials and 1 entity with whom you will continue to deal and continue to coordinate, we would have 50 elected officials. We'd have 10 different entities. It's, from our perspective, a much less wieldy structure, and we think one that not only accomplishes our objectives much more poorly, but frankly serves you less well as well. So as we've said, you have several CDDs in the county. This will, in essence, function like a very large community development district. There are several benefits associated with the district mechanism for community governance. It does allow for growth to pay for itself. This puts in place a bondable, bankable mechanism that will allow us to fulfill the exactions that we've agreed upon with you, the promises that we've made and the commitments that we've made, and it allows us to do it in a cost-effective manner. I think it's important to recognize that it does not put a burden on anyone who does not choose to live within the stewardship district. The district explicitly in this legislation does not have the ability to reach outside of its boundaries and levy assessments, levy taxes, etc. Those are all secured only on the land within the boundaries, which with the disclosure that's called for in the Act, you get to make a decision as to whether you want to buy that piece of property, buy that home, and live within the district. All of your environmental regulations, your building codes, your zoning codes, your other regulations all remain in full force and effect. It's made very clear at a number of places in the legislation that that's the case, and I think Mr. Mullen has reviewed that. Nothing about this establishment of this district changes those things one iota. The district explicitly doesn't have the ability to comp plan and zone and do all of those things that are reserved to you, and that's consistent with what you'll see in other district mechanisms around the state. Now, this is not a handy-dandy fact about districts, but it's a quote from one of my favorite movies, which is The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance. And we think it frames where we want to go in terms of summing up, which is, if you recall the movie, at the very end, Jimmy Stewart is explaining and telling the story of who really shot Liberty Valance, John Wayne's character. And the newspaper editor says, well, this is the West. When the legend becomes fact, print the legend. We've heard a lot of legends and concerns about the stewardship district, and so we wanted to address those. One is the ability to expand the district, and we've worked through some specific language with your staff to be sure that the boundaries of the district can only be expanded with your specific consent. So it does similarly then require an act of the legislature, but the legislation is very clear that before the district can be expanded, it has to come back to you, has to obtain your consent to do that. Just as we're here asking for your consent by way of the no objection letter on Monday to move forward with the legislation. Another thing we've heard is that the creation of the district may reduce tax revenue coming into the county. Absolutely not true. There is not one iota of words in this legislation that will reduce your property tax revenue or any other revenue that you would impose upon the lands within the ENCPA. Whether this district exists or not, you'll get every bit of revenue out of those properties and from those future residents that you otherwise would have. In fact, as we make the point here, we think that you'll get that revenue sooner. And the reason is that, as you saw from our slide earlier, many of the top selling communities, Lakewood Ranch, Ave Maria, West Villages, Vieira, all have stewardship districts to provide for this orderly, efficient financing of infrastructure, putting things in up front, not waiting to pay for them out of the revenue stream associated with the real estate project. Homes get built faster, you get your tax revenue faster, but you get what you would get, not one iota less. That's just simply not true. We've also heard, as I've already said, that somehow the stewardship district will change your planning and zoning regulations, any of your enforcement authority. Absolutely not true. The district can provide additional services over and above what you may do, to the extent, for example, that we build a road, convey that to you. We may want to do enhanced landscaping, we have the authority to go in and do that, but it doesn't change anything about what you do to accept that road, your speed limits, what you went into the process to approve that road, etc. All of those regulations remain intact. We've heard concerns that passage of this legislation creates a new town. It does not. As we've said, it creates a special taxing district, much like a CDD. Doesn't change any of the state law standards for incorporation, and this doesn't create a town. And nowhere will you see in this legislation any allusion to that. We've also heard that somehow the burden of the improvements that could be financed by the stewardship district will come to burden your existing residents elsewhere in the county. Again, absolutely not true. As we've reviewed with your staff, the language in this act makes it clear that we can only tax and assess within our boundaries. We'll do so typically on a revenue bond basis, so that we are selling bonds backed by special assessments only on the lands within the boundaries of the stewardship district. That's the typical district mechanism. Does not reach outside the boundaries whatsoever. In fact, it's a way to provide a mechanism in place that in the long term, through the interlocal agreements that are contemplated in this act, we can continue to cooperate and provide services and facilities within the ENCPA that are frankly in accordance with what you've expected out of the initial approval process. I'll move into the timeline a little bit. Here we are today with this workshop. We'll be back with you on Monday. We're asking for you to consider approval of a non-objection letter, which is the same action you took last year. The format of that letter, we can continue to work with your staff, but exactly the format that you provided last year is what we're asking for, nothing more, nothing less. We'd like to get that done because on December 1st, we'll be here for a public hearing with your local legislative delegation. And we think it's to everybody's benefit if we're all able to walk in and meet with our delegates and let them know that you have not objected to that process so that they can proceed. Because at a minimum, and at the very bottom line, the bill cannot be filed if you don't issue the letter of no objection. We do hope to file it in February before the deadline, which comes up in March 1 in advance of the 2017 session. We hope that the legislature will favorably consider it as they work through the many issues I'm sure they will face. and we hope it will receive favorable consideration by the governor. Other bills similarly situated in the last couple of years that have worked through the process did receive that favorable consideration, and so we do expect that will be the case. With that, I'm going to turn it back to Charles for a few minutes to wrap up, and then we'll be available for any questions you may have.